Live. Hello, YouTube viewers. This is your host, Steve, and I'm here with Robertus again. And I think we haven't done a video in a while, and we thought that there's no better day really, or depending on your point of view, to do a video. Today's September 4th. This date, over 1,500 years ago, the Roman Empire in the West met its end. So it's fitting that we return to Rome. What you want to offer in memory of the empire that once was?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Aurelian32, and well, Stephen, for having me back on your show with your viewers who are gracious enough to watch us. But I figured it was important to have a discussion today about the Roman Empire. I've been thinking a lot about the Romans for the past couple of months, especially in their relationship to the United States, especially with this idea of exceptionalism and legacies. With the United States, what we get, especially during the late 19th century, is this idea among white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right, of continuation of being a continuation of the legacy of British greatness, right? The Anglo-Saxon, especially English Americans in the Northeast and maybe even in the South, begin to engage in this discourse about a civilizing mission to the world. This is around the time that the United States engages with its war in Spain against, well, not in Spain, in Cuba, I think, kicking the Spaniards out of Cuba. Around the time that, Puerto Rico, right. It was around the time Teddy Roosevelt's presidency and I think McKinley's presidency, and you get this discourse trying to justify American imperialism abroad. But it's done in a way that kind of frames the U.S. as an extension of British greatness, either because the U.S. is primarily peopled by Anglo-Saxons, but also because of ideological reasons, right? The U.S. is kind of an ideological extension carrying the banner of classical liberalism, either to the world or, at least as a representation. I was wondering if the Romans considered themselves to be an extension of the ancient Greek legacy, either in a cultural or political sense. Like in retrospect, we can see how they were, right? But I'm interested in how the Romans perceived themselves, right? And I think that's important because when you look at the way that imperial projects or great powers, superpowers are built, right? It's important to see whether they actually intended to do this or if it was actually an accident. And among American and I guess especially Roman writers like Sallust, they thought that they had acquired this empire by accident, right? Maybe that's putting the cart ahead of the horse. But when it comes to the Romans, to what extent did they see themselves as an extension of the Greeks? Did they have a superiority complex vis-a-vis the Greeks? I was wondering if we could start a discussion off with that.
Sure. Well, depends what you mean by you're discussing the Greeks, and there's several components and facets to it. I think Romans felt a sense of cultural superiority in certain aspects. Romans were more practically minded. The Greeks tended to there wasn't really a Roman penchant for like drama, tragedy,
right.
Poetry, things of that nature. The Romans, we think about their great architectural achievements.
Right.
They were attracted to the Stoics, which is a more rational-minded form of philosophy. So culturally, it's mixed, right? And you had competing camps within Rome. You had, Scipio, who was very Hellenized, and then Cato embodying more agrarian, I guess we would call traditional Roman values. So there's this tension there, but at the same time, you have examples from militarily. Alexander the Great, par excellence. He was the general that the Roman generals aspired to be. So he, I think, in many, Alexander's legacy going conquering Persia into India. That was many Romans tried to emulate that. Crassus, before he was defeated at Carrhae, Mark Antony attempted to do the same as well, and had very actually, you could argue his defeat at the hands of the Persians resulted in a loss of his legitimacy and helped Octavian eventual victory. And then also Trajan's last great campaigns in the East were motivated by this desire to emulate Alexander. So he was like, you had a Greek serving as like the military standard for the Romans, and as he has for many cultures. So what to answer your question, and then over time you see Hellenistic influences begin to permeate throughout. Obviously, with the Christianization of the Roman Empire, Christianity have been to make it more appealing to Gentiles, have been fused with Hellenistic philosophy, right? Greek forms of governance, especially in the Eastern Empire, began to take over. But specifically with the early Republican era, over time, the Greek, because the Greeks answered to traditionally, like a lot of aspects of Greek culture appealed or addressed things that Romans were trying to trivialize and minimize.
Right.
So the Greek culture eventually had developed. Rome is Hellenized to some extent. I think Horace said, Rome has conquered. Rome conquered Greece, but Greece has also conquered Rome.
Yes.
So you have these. It's a complicated story, but I think it also distinguishes from the American context. There's clearly like a clear blood descent, right? Like the American elite predominantly was Anglo-Saxon descended, and thus, just like in England, they were Anglo-Saxons. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Romans were, I believe, Latin Italic people. The Greeks were not necessarily from the same stock, so it wasn't like the Greeks founded Rome. And actually, matter of fact, it was the enemies of, the legends have, it was the enemies of Greece that conquered Rome, or that founded Rome. It was Aeneas. It was Aeneas. It was the survivor of Troy, the arch nemesis of the Greeks, who they conquered in the Iliad. So the Romans, when they set up their history, it was very much in opposition to to Greek culture. They very much viewed themselves as distinct from the Greeks. Right. So it's
there's a tension there that
there's a tension, but also a mutual admiration, and eventually it is only Greek. The Greeks are willing partners, or viewed to be nearest to Romans in the end, because you have a development of a Greco-Roman culture.
For sure.
So in a way, they kind of share power in this great empire.
That's funny that you mentioned that. They kind of share power. I think the term mare, RC, what is it called? Mare
Nostrum.
RC, I think from what I've read, actually refers to the joint ownership of the Greeks and Romans. I think it may not actually have been that, but Mare Nostrum could very well represent a kind of joint Hellenic Latin ownership over the Mediterranean cultures and civilizations. It's kind of interesting. You actually do see that tension between the U.S. and the British kind of elites, right? And U.S. and British culture, right? I mean, Britain is much more hierarchical and austere, whereas the U.S. is characterized as more, I guess, lionizing upward social mobility. I think that it was kind of the reverse between the Greeks and Romans, right? I mean, the Romans considered themselves more masculine. They considered themselves more practical, more realistic, more materialist. And the Romans kind of characterized the Greeks as, I would say, as kind of effeminate or effete. Would you say that there is a kind of a discourse of Roman exceptionalism in the same way that the U.S. does. Right? The U.S. considers itself the shining city on the hill, both during its imperial era and during its pre-imperial era. Right? Even while it was an isolationist entity, there was a sense that the U.S. has something special that distinguishes it from most civilizations. Was that, and I think some of that stems out of a need on the part of these imperialists or these superpowers to kind of justify why they reached this level, this pinnacle of power. Was there any of that with the ancient Romans, or?
I mean, undoubtedly, Roman exceptionalism permeates throughout the era of Roman expansion.
Right.
And it does serve as a means to justify the imperium or explain why this came to be. That there was something unique to Roman culture that facilitated such a quick expansion.
Right.
And in contrast, obviously America, John Winthrop, the city on the hill, right? And that's been evoked throughout American history to justify kind of this myth, this land removed from the chaos and troubles of the old world. Rome wasn't like that in that sense, that but it did. They did view themselves as a pinnacle of civilization. They were civilization, civitas, stem. The word for civilization stems from the Roman word for state.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, so like, listen, like, we conquered you because we were better than you, and this is why we're better. We have these values, these institutions that make us better. So, and then even, and I think also in some sense the fortune of the Aeneid. Now this is later. It's just Augustus is doing this, right? But I think, removing themselves from the Greeks, like they're their own entity, right? They're, the stock of Troy. They're giving Rome a unique history, a unique mission, filled with motifs and themes of Rome's destiny. Rome is destined to rule the world.
Right.
Romulus and Remus were suckled by a she-wolf, right? We're a martial people, and we won't be satiated until we rule the world. And that is our mission. That is our birthright, because we are Romans. And in America has a similar. We have these unique values where, this tradition of classical liberalism that we feel, or that some feel needs to be spread throughout the world, like the neocon and the elements of the center left. And in Rome viewed itself as a universal kingdom. I think the key is universalism, the universal impulse. Rome was a universal civilization,
right?
Except Roman rule, and anyone could be a Roman. It was where, and same thing with American. You accept our values, our way of life. You could be an American regardless of your background, race, religion.
That's an interesting parallel. Yeah.
There lies the similarity in that regard. I don't think the Romans viewed themselves as like, they come, bring us your poor and your haggard.
No.
The Romans says, stop acting like a woman. You act like men. It was very like gender dualism was very apparent. There was masculine and feminine behaviors. I mean, this is a different conversation, but he prided himself on certain behaviors. So it's not. It's similar, obviously, but different at the same time.
Right. That's actually excellent parallel that you make there. You're kind of combining two conversations in one very well. Like this question of one similarity between the Romans and the Americans is that Roman and American identity are both universal, right? You can be anything. You can come from any background, and yet you can become a citizen, right? For the Romans, extending citizenship was instrumental, was for strategic reasons, so that they could win local allies, right, and make them collaborators. But for the U.S., it's a little bit different. But the idea is that, if you ascribe to these values, in the Roman case, maybe if you can speak Latin, if you care about justice, order, jurisprudence, in the United States, if you care about classical liberalism, rights, then you're an American, right? And that's pretty much it. So there is a nebulous quality to the identity question that I guess both with the Roman and American projects, right? What the conception of what was an American and what was a Roman, it was very parochial, right? It was very localistic. You're Anglo-Saxon. If you're an American, it means you probably have some Anglo-Saxon ancestry, right? There's a racial ideal. But it gradually extends as more and more rights are won and extended, and eventually anybody can become an American, right? Yeah, you can come here after a couple of years and earn your citizenship. The same could be said of Rome too, pretty much, right? I mean, it begins as purely as a parochial Latin, just a subset of Italians, really, as what qualified as a Roman. But eventually, after gradual struggles, civil wars in both the American and Roman case, right, the conception of what qualified as an American or a Roman gradually extended, and that's to the point that anybody from any background could become a Roman. St. Paul, I think we discussed this at one point, there's an exceptional quality about being a Roman citizen, right? St. Paul says to the soldiers, "I'm a Roman citizen," and they leave him alone, right? Because there's something special about it. Eventually, Roman citizenship is universalized to almost everybody. It's almost interesting to me, though, that I guess for the Romans, I have a feeling that certainly with the United States, there's a tradition of reluctance to embrace this kind of global superpower status. Throughout the 19th century, there's this discourse of isolationism, which they inherit from the British. We don't want to be involved in imperial entanglements. The Romans, that's less the case, but there's still this kind of incipient or nascent reluctance to take on this new responsibility. But I guess people like these more Hellenized Romans like Scipio, who are more cosmopolitan, kind of say, wait a second, we can't be the parochial, simple-minded, just plain Roman Italians anymore. We are global leaders now. We have to take on this new obligation. I see that kind of paralleling with the United States on the eve of World War II during the 40s, having to overcome its isolationist strain in the same way that the Romans had to overcome their parochial strain. And in a sense, the Americans became more like Britain, more globalist. And in a sense, the Romans did become more like the Greeks, more globalist, more cosmopolitan. So I guess that's an interesting parallel. I guess kind of to move the conversation along a little bit, I think one thing I'm kind of interested in is there's a lot of discussion about the fall of the Roman Empire, and that's the whole the point of our conversation right now, right? There's a lot of discussion on the fall of the Roman Empire, but the explanations vary according to your ideological point of view, right? It seems as if the Romans, I guess you can tell a lot about a person's ideological point of view in their explanation of why the Roman Empire fell, right? The conservatives on the right, social conservatives, religious conservatives will talk more about, right, the social degradation, moral degradation, right? Libertarians will talk about the debt that the Romans incurred. The alternative right and nationalists and those kinds of folks would talk about the Romans maybe failing to premise their empire on a firm substance, being a proposition nation where anybody can become a Roman, and how that kind of cheapens the identity or what it means to be a Roman citizen. Those explanations. On the left, I think you get less discussion of why the Roman Empire fell, right? And on the left, what you get is conversations about, really, it does reflect kind of Edward Gibbons, I think is his name, Gibson or something.
Yeah.
Talking about Christianity as the source of the fall. I think that one atheist guy, Richard Carrier, that you and I have talked about, blames it on Christianity, right? The old values are basically abandoned, screw the old values. And this kind of feeds into the rhetoric of the alt-right, right? Like this kind of abandon your old tradition, embrace this new identity, Christianity, and destroy rationality and ethics, or not destroy rationality and substitute it with superstition. That's a left-wing discourse. Also on the left, this discussion, another explanation on the left for the Roman Empire's collapse is overextension, and how that breeds kind of this, I guess, overextension kind of breeds a kind of bureaucratic state. And that's kind of a libertarian argument too, but a critique of imperialism and trying to link that to critiques of the United States, right? What most explanations about the fall of the Roman Empire are really just trying to make commentary on why the United States might be in decline, or why the superpower status is being weakened. I kind of wanted to discuss like this idea of the overextension of the empire. Do you think that there's something strange about how the Roman Empire, and I would say the Brits and the United States, kind of get bogged down in the Middle East, and how it's, and I think toward the third and fourth century, 40% of the Roman imperial military might is committed to fighting the Persians? And isn't that like a little bit strange? Like what is that about? Is that tied into this Alexander the Great thing, or do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think it's twofold, right? You could look at the Alexandrian Empire.
Right.
Hold on. Okay. And I mean, there's something to that. At the but you could also say like, well, the only real glory to be run in a culture which had expanded through generals who were motivated by self-interest in some cases. Persia was the last great conquest where one could achieve fame and glory. So there's a desire to achieve victory over the Persians in combat in order to enhance your status within the empire.
Right.
You can also look at it from an economic perspective. The trade routes to China were paramount.
Right.
A lot of the wealth, it was in antiquity. You had three massive polities that controlled pretty much world trade in the known world. You had Han China, either Parthia or Sassanid Persia, and then the Roman Empire, right? And you had this stability that allowed for traffic, right? Silk was a thing that was very much prized upon Rome, and apparently these monks from the empire managed to steal some silkworms from China, and the Chinese the Han had prohibited, and no one could know the secrets to the development of silk upon penalty of death, right? So war with Persia was necessary to control the trade routes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Theoretically, control of Mesopotamia will lead one to control the Persian Gulf, and thus direct access to India, right, over the Indian coast, as opposed to the longer route around Egypt and the Red Sea. So there's an economic motive to conquer or to war with Persia. There's also the Alexandrian impulse,
right?
So I think those are the two main reasons. Especially when at the northern frontier, there wasn't really much of a threat. So the conquest of Dacia by Trajan in the early 2nd century AD they had an organized polity, and there was much of mineral wealth within Dacia to justify that conquest. Outside of, obviously Dacians were, raiding, and they had extracted tribute from the previous emperor Domitian, which was an affront to the honor of the empire and needed to be dealt with. But in the northern, the Rhine frontier, the Nubian frontier, and the Saharan frontier wasn't. You had some tribesmen. That North Africa was largely secure for most of the empire,
right?
But Persia was the main threat, and also the wealth, the traffic, the trade. Was so crucial,
right?
So I think that's why the Romans were bogged in the Middle East, and why were we bogged in the Middle East? A lot of people mention oil, right?
Yeah,
there's oil well.
The oil,
now they didn't know about oil back then. They were more preoccupied with spices and sold like luxury goods that which the West
Yeah.
couldn't produce on its own. But oil is what we hear a lot about nowadays, and that's why we get bogged down in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Western powers typically there's a need there, and it was a conduit. It's always been a conduit between East and West, between the Orient and the Occident.
Yeah.
So it's important, and that's why it's
They
always
get bogged down.
people everyone's were bogged down there.
Right.
Um,
And that seems to be one of the common critiques of imperium, right? One of the things that people who are critical of either neoconservatives and Wilsonian internationalists oftentimes say is, why are you so upset over the Russians having their sphere of influence and the Chinese having their sphere of influence? I guess the critique really is that this kind of globalist impulse, this desire to influence the entire world and to kind of incorporate everything under. I think you used to say the Romans wanted to get all the way to China, right, or India or whatever. They wanted to be the new Alexander Great. This unwillingness to be satisfied with limits and to kind of allow other states and superpowers to maintain their own rightful sphere of influence. I think that's kind of what happened with the Romans too, where they kind of engage in this perpetual war with the Persians, and see them as rivals instead of as partners. Maybe back then that wasn't even a conception. It seems like for every Roman emperor or Roman executive, warfare, engaging in warfare, is seen as almost like as a necessity, like it's inherent in the office. And it kind of does remind me of American presidents who talk about, well, the Romans talked about the Roman peace, where in fact there was warfare pretty much every decade. And most American presidents would try to say, look, we don't want to engage in foreign entanglements, or we want to be engaged in diplomacy. We don't want to overextend ourselves overseas. Bush with his the first presidential election, saying we're not interested in nation building, ends up engaged in nation building. It seems to be kind of a double speak, right? Right. The Romans talk about the Roman peace, right, and yet there's constant war, and the American presidents want fewer body bags, right, and yet there's constant warfare. Like, is that how far should we carry that analogy? What do you think of that?
So you're trying to compare the Pax Romana and the Pax Americana, and I mean, like, it's just simple. You have a period of a superpower, like a hegemon,
Right.
And there's a general peace. Obviously, there's never like a complete peace. I mean, I find that, I don't know. I think it's more of a generic. I mean, the Roman, you talk about a Pax Romana, but then you have like a lot of the three major Jewish revolts within that period. There's revolts there's war on the frontiers. You have in 69 AD the year of the four emperors, right?
Right.
So there's conflict that abounds in this period within the core territories of the empire. There's a peace. Likewise, in America, we haven't had, and people count Pearl Harbor. That's really on the periphery. It's like saying, yeah, like the Rhine frontier was attacked.
Right.
It's not, but there hasn't been a warfare on the American on the mainland since 1812.
Right.
Or 1815 by a foreign power, right? Because the Civil War actually happened, but like since 1815, Battle of New Orleans, when Jackson won his victory over the British. So we're talking about like essentially like a comparable like space of period of 200 years, where there hasn't been, like, Italy is largely untouched, or the American mainland is largely untouched. I think it's superficial to some extent, though. I mean, where have we fought our wars? In like Vietnam, in Korea, Iraq, sending troops like Somalia. These are peripheral actions.
Right.
There's a constant war, but the core has been at peace for some time. So I don't want to diminish. I wouldn't diminish the notion of like there's this general peace. There's not peace for everyone,
Right.
but a significant portion of what you want to dub the
Yeah. Yeah.
empire is largely secure. It's largely secure.
Right.
Um,
Huh.
so I don't know if
Okay.
you were trying to imply that like it's a false notion. It's false in the absolute sense,
Yeah.
but if you kind of like if you
Relative
try
sense.
to relative sense, it is very much
Right.
a reality.
Sure.
Um, and I guess I'm trying to think of other examples. They called the 19th century like the Pax Britannica, right? After the
Mhm.
defeat of Napoleon to the end of World War to the start of World War One.
Right.
But you have the wars of unification, Germany and Italy. You have the Crimean War. There's things going on in Europe between the powers.
Right.
But I guess, but the point is like, oh, we're spared a total war. So it's false in that, like, I think these periods of peace, they're portrayed as peace in the absolute sense, but it's more a relative sense. Is my
Right.
point.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. Okay. Yeah. I guess we could move on to a next topic. Um, this idea of like, I guess the alt-right talks about the proposition nation, right? They don't like the idea that we don't premise American identity on kind of a cultural or racial anchor, right? And they argue that the argument is over whether diversity is a strength. Well, the argument for their explanation for the fall of the Roman Empire is that, hey, the fall of the Roman Empire, they didn't have any unified sense of peoplehood, right? Could the counter argument be, well, wait a second, the Roman Empire is extremely diverse. They lasted a lot longer than other powers that were more homogeneous. And in a sense, maybe I'd say this diversity, this how do we say, this heterogeneity was an advantage initially, right? Because they were able to incorporate all these different elements, the Celtic military strategy, Greek military strategy, Etruscan, Carthaginian. But in terms of actual governance, it became more difficult over time. What do you think about that? Like is it valid to say that was that citizenship was initially an advantage, granting citizenship to all sorts of people was an advantage, and maybe it became more difficult over time? Because I don't see it so much discussed in the literature, like scholarly literature, that Rome being diverse hurt it. Like, what do you think about this discussion?
So I will say this.
Yeah.
Diversity is a strength in the sense that it provides a greater pool of talented individuals from which to draw from, right?
Right.
But I think and I can't speak for the alt-right, but I think it is appropriate and not, speculative, and not entirely speculative, to suggest that there needs to be somehow or some general and broad definition of
Yeah.
whatever polity, what it means to be a member of that polity.
Yeah.
So when citizenship in the Roman context becomes universal, that you lose the kind of the traditional rise to citizenship. The assimilation process is lost, right? Because if you're born in the empire, you're a Roman, regardless of whether you've inculcated certain values in a
Yeah.
worldview. But if you look at Roman history, right? Initially, the emperors were from Italy, but then you see a gradual shift. And not necessarily a bad thing. Like the five good emperors, a lot of them they were of Italian descent, but a lot of them were from Spain, right?
Mm.
Of the great military leaders that saved the empire during the crisis were from Illyria.
Wow.
You have different portions of the empire contributing toward the perseverance of the empire. But I wouldn't say. But was Trajan less of a Roman than Augustus, or was Aurelian, my namesake, less of a Roman because he wasn't an Italian or a Latin? No, but he had, they had been brought up regardless of their background and had, risen through the ranks and had kind of been brought a part of the civilization.
Right.
so when you cheapen when you cheapen citizenship, then it becomes less valuable in many sense, and
Right,
and it becomes less aspirational. You want people to aspire to something.
right, right,
Um, so I wouldn't as the original Italian stock of Rome eventually became insignificant, others populations who had become Romanized, right? So they weren't of Roman blood, but they had been conquered. They were different provinces, diverse. People considered themselves Romans, and they had a stake in the system. Um, but I think when when you kind of lose that what a notion of what the culture is, it loses meaning, and eventually the
right.
identity fades into oblivion.
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
and likewise here, right? Like, over time, the original Anglo-Saxon element diminished, but you had contributions from people who they weren't necessarily of Anglo-Saxon stock, but
right,
they were very much Americans. They bought into the founding ideals and the principles.
right.
Well, on the right feel that like we're losing that by
Right.
having open borders, offering amnesty to people, right?
Yeah.
That shouldn't be
So
because they're not becoming American.
right, right. So that's the debate, and I guess the kind of what you actually see, right, is these different notions of exceptionalism, right? I guess what makes the Roman and American projects exceptional is that they are, in a sense, universal, right? Almost anybody can ascribe to it. And I guess what you're talking about is the kind of point of view where uh, the question is there in that kind of heterogeneity or diversity, the need for a common sentimental attachment to the ideal, whether it's being a Roman citizen or an American citizen, that needs to be maintained. Um, and that's actually interesting. Uh, I, I guess what I think in terms of the Roman context, perhaps toward the end of the empire, the idea that there's a need for a unifying element is one of the reasons why Christianity really gained steam or is promoted. Um, and I guess that kind of in some ways displaced the ideal of just being a Roman citizen or the civic administration. What do we call it? The um, uh, basically there's a term that Machiavelli uses. Civic virtue, that's the term. The civic virtue becomes replaced by kind of ecclesiastical virtue. And I guess that's more of the left perspective that I'm giving. But yeah, I mean, you articulate, I guess, the right perspective on the right leaning side of the political spectrum. Um, I guess we can move on to the other portion of our discussion. One of the interesting parallels between the Roman and political projects is that this link between the executive and imperial power, as we mentioned. What I find fascinating is that early in the American and Roman political projects, the Senate is dominant. But over time, there's kind of a story that maybe you can tell briefly. And this actually has to do with the anniversary of Augustus Caesar's founding of the Roman Empire in the Battle of Actium, I think, where you see the
defeat of Mark Antony.
Right,
Or,
right.
Octavian defeats Mark Antony.
Right. One of the things you see from on both the left and the right politically is a complaint. Libertarians on the right and on the center left, certainly people who dislike militarism and maybe centralized power violation of civil liberties, is the way that the legislature in the U.S. has continually ceded power to the presidency. But that has kind of been facilitated partially by warfare. Like, could you talk about those, like the Roman case of that, or what happened?
So sure. I mean, I think and I've actually done a great deal of research on this. Actually, you see, I think you can see the the seeds for the destruction of the Republic really going back to the Punic Wars. Essentially, the means with which the Romans resorted to defeat a figure like Hannibal, pointing extraordinary powers to Scipio, in order for military exigencies, right? That eroded, but again, but it's not like Scipio didn't seize power or anything. He had no notions of this. But you established a precedent for certain behaviors that over time, when you have more unscrupulous individuals coming to the front, they'll exploit them. So you look at the Punic War, you establish a precedent where where soldiers are dependent on a general for survival.
Right.
And then someone like Marius introduces reforms where recruit from essentially any segment of society, where prior you used to have just citizens, so people who owned property, who could afford to be to enter the army, buy their own armor, what have you. They were now, they was not just them; it was like the poor of society. So again, you establish a precedent where troops being dependent on the soldier, right? But the troops in Scipio's day had their own property, right?
Right.
So they weren't necessarily, it's not like they're going to necessarily be bribed into, doing things that are unconstitutional by the general. But if you're poor, et cetera, you're going to be more prone to do things. You're more susceptible to certain behaviors through bribery or the promise of loot and land, what have you. So then the wars between Marius and Sulla, you wrote the Republic.
Right.
Obviously, we get to not Cicero, but Caesar and Pompey, and obviously and Antony or Octavian. And this also is a byproduct of empire, right? The empire expands, and the wealth. This sounds like a leftist argument, but it's true. The wealth is concentrated in the hands of the senatorial class. They're the ones who are leading the armies in combat. They're the ones who are gaining, estates abroad throughout the new provinces. They're generating the wealth, and it's not really trickling down to the rest of society. And then the citizen soldiers, they're off abroad in Greece and Spain or in Africa, and they can't get the harvest.
Yeah.
So their farms, they go into debt, and there's no state relief or any notion of this. So what do you do when you can't pay off these debts? You have to sell the land, and who gets the land? The wealthy senators who are already benefiting from the conquest. So then you have to develop these large, massive estates. You have increasing inequality, a larger segment of society that's impoverished, and they're more susceptible to. And generals have been more empowered, given the nature of the wars they've been fighting against great minds like Hannibal. And I think it was manifold the quality of generals, but I think more so just the distances involved. And we have to remember, we're dealing with antiquity.
Right.
When you're a general often you're fighting Mithridates in Asia Minor, you can't be communicating with the Senate on a day-to-day basis. You have a lot of leeway in conducting affairs. You're empowered, and I think certain individuals are going to, out of a sense of moral righteousness or whatever, they're going to adhere to certain principles and values. Whether people are going to, but again, Romans they press an emphasis on glory and fame, and Caesar. There's an opportunity.
Right.
There's an opportunity to enhance my prestige and power in Rome.
Right.
So, and also some of these, like someone like Caesar who considers himself a populist or popularis, you might have, to some extent, I don't think it was, might have been part of his calculus. He's like, this system doesn't really work for a lot of people.
Right.
And, and maybe I can fix it. And so I don't want to entirely attribute his actions to just a lust for power.
Right.
But
that's interesting. You mentioned that. So it's almost like the executive general, or the position of a military executive, right, kind of creates the opportunity to get things done instantly, right? And that's something that appeals to the public. And in some ways, that's how the Roman executive authorities or
chief executive officer.
Yeah, right. Caesar, ultimately Augustus, maybe Marius, and others kind of circumvent the Senate aristocrats who are arrogant and out of touch, right? And in this way, I guess that's how, in some ways, you see now in the United States, right? The Senate and the legislature find it very difficult to get anything done. So American presidents over the past 2 or 3 decades, certainly the last 2 or 3 presidents, have resorted to more executive orders, right? Right. So they didn't even need it, right. So and
I think a good what you just brought. I think there's a great analogy was that over the many during, let's say, from about 50 BC and going back maybe like 70, 80 years,
right.
there's attempts going back, maybe let's say the Gracchi Bros in the 130s BC. There's attempts like, let's get land reform, let's do something to try to resolve these
Yeah.
these issues. And then the senatorial class, the optimate faction, becomes just, to the public, they're just a wall of opposition. They don't offer any solutions, and they're just defending these abstract notions, their ancient rights, their place in society. They're trying to tell people, like, we need to preserve this because we lose these rights, it's all over.
Right.
Well, like the Romans, like, I don't have any land, I can't feed my family, like, like the hell with your rights.
Right.
Caesar says he could solve these things. He says he's going to give me land so I could have a place to provide.
Right.
And it's kind of like how, let's say the GOP Congress is viewed as like this wall of opposition without really, that doesn't really offer solutions.
Sure.
It's very much a similar, and people get fed up, so they look to someone that at least says they can solve problems, and
right. And in this case, it would be, I guess, the populist, like Caesar or Trump, or on the left case, Bernie Sanders, right? These people who say, look, there are practical things we can do that a president can do to solve problems. And the elites who are out of touch, the Senate, the Senate nexus, they dominate. They basically control more or less everything. And they're the most hated people in the whole country. And it's a similar thing with the Romans. And I think you and I have talked about this, right? Actually, the Federalist Papers say, Madison says, we don't want a democracy, right? We want a republic so that our property is protected. And we don't want popular participation because these people are basically illiterates. That's the same thing the ancient Romans said, right? Cicero, but maybe not so much Cicero, but I'm sure Cato may have said that what matters is our ancient constitutional rights, right? It's a kind of conservatism in ancient Rome is similar to conservatism in the U.S., right?
They don't frame it in the same way, but they have this. They have a similar operating impulse. Yeah.
Right. So it's like So like the elites in the U.S. and the elites in ancient Rome are fighting a two-front war against the popular masses, who they want to have less participatory rights, and they're also fighting a war against the central executive, right? Whether it be Bush or Obama, who they think are exercising too much executive autonomous power through either warfare, war making, or whatever. And in the ancient Roman case, Cicero is actually writing, I think you actually said this, right? Complaining that Caesar is a warmonger. This war against the Celtic tribes in Gaul is nothing to do with our own national defense. It's your glorification, as an executive. In the case of Cicero, I'm sure he was sincere. I don't know how many of our current legislature, like in the United States, are sincere, but it's kind of funny how you get this moral indignation on the part of legislators and Senate elites in both the Roman and American case, and yet they're the most hated class out there. So I guess that, and you're right, like that kind of does underlie the founding or the seed of the Roman Empire's undoing, right? I mean, you have the basis for executive tyranny to be formed, right? Because people are so fed up with the legislative system, right, that they say, look, if this isn't working, the elites aren't going to protect us. We're going to choose the strong man, whether it be, Augustus
And
Caesar. Yeah.
The only times in which it's difficult for the executive to expand his authority or establish precedents in peacetime, but
Right.
but the only time in which, let's say, the nobility or the elites, senatorial class, are willing to cede their rights is in wartime. So the Romans had no problems. The Roman elites, the senators, had no problems empowering Scipio to defeat Hannibal as long as he got the job done.
Right.
So, same during the Civil War, and how many people were crying over Lincoln suspending habeas corpus?
Yeah. Yeah.
Defeat the Confederates. Let's reunite the country.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's in times of war, but it also, but regardless, the establishment of these, by breaking, establishing precedents, that they'll eventually override the Republican system, because the Republican system is limited, and it only works. It works where there's an elite that's, the elite has to be somewhat responding to the needs of the masses,
Right.
but in they're safeguarding their privileges, and in a sense,
Right.
they understand what's best for the state because they're stakeholders in the state. The state is, in a sense, their corporation, and they're all
Board of Executives.
they're the board of executives, so that they know they know what's best to keep it running.
Right.
Well,
and I guess the tragic history of republics is that when they eventually fail to be responsive, right, what you eventually get is opportunists, whether you like them or don't like them, whether you vote for them or not. Caesars, the Augustus, the Gracchi brothers, who I think were more sincere, or the Trumps, or the Sanders, whoever is going to run in and claim legitimacy and ultimately probably maybe authoritarian power. Maybe not Sanders, since he's so benevolent. But okay,
that's what they want you to think.
We'll skip that. We'll skip that discussion for later. But I don't know if you have any time for more conversation. Just you have fantasy football to play, right? So that's really
it. Yeah. But I mean, we could go on. You could go on for hours about this. I think there's a lot of parallels. I think the core is that they're both proposition nations, and fundamental, and they both were started. Well, Rome started out as a kingdom. You could argue, in our colonial phase, we were part of a kingdom. I mean, that's not a fallacy. We have a similar trajectory to Rome in some respects. So it's fascinating things to compare. And I think they're both sides are driven by different impulses, and both have undergone similar evolution.
It's funny how in both cases, it's funny how in America and Rome, it's a civil war that really takes the impetus to extend citizenship. Right. I think there was a slave war. Civil wars over slavery. I don't know the civil war history of the Roman Republic very well, but
you're 100% right. There's a social war. They call it a social war, but it's really a civil war between Italians and Latins, right? The traditional. The Romans didn't want to extend rights to Italians, and they're like, but we've been a part of the enterprise for a few centuries now. It's like, we've been fighting your wars, we've been dying for you.
Yeah.
So we deserve to be citizens. So definitely that, and then during the course of the civil wars, you see kind of like Caesar, Augustus. They expand the franchise now, not to the extent that's expanded later on in the empire under like Caracalla expands it to everybody.
Right.
But either provincials or certain provincials are included within the Roman project. So there's definitely something to that.
Right. It's almost as if authoritarianism, or not authoritarian, populism, the impulse to extend citizenship is linked to the kind of strongman or the promises of popular leaders, whether it's Andrew Jackson, who extends the voting rights or participation to basically working class white men, and in the case of the Romans, it's these popular generals who probably really don't care about voting rights, but are using the people as tools, maybe useful idiots, to kind of aggrandize themselves. In the United States, I think it actually takes a huge war for the rights of blacks, of former slaves, for their rights, voting rights, to be formally codified or protected, even though it took an extra 100 years for that to actually be protected in reality. It's interesting. It's kind of a tragic tome or testimony to the history of republics that it takes warfare for rights to be extended. If we were to connect this to the broader history of European civilization, European history, it's almost as if the people who articulate the idea of constitutional rights or limited government are in fact the elites who are trying to protect themselves from either being expropriated, but more often not are concerned about central executive powers claiming too much authority. I had always thought of the feudal era as being this authoritarian, kings get to do anything they want. But instead, what we actually see is
it's limited government.
It's limits on their rights, right? Because and the Magna Carta kind of enshrines, or kind of is a great example of the nobility invoking these things. Yes, to protect their privileges, only for themselves, but that's kind of the wellspring for these kind of for more well-developed ideas. And in fact, the Baron de Montesquieu, right? It wasn't right. He was a noble. A member of the aristocracy, and he was the one who came with the idea of separation of powers, or he articulated it as a classical liberal kind of bedrock. And it's not what you would hear, I guess, from either, I guess, mainstream historians, and also, I guess, from more Marxist history, is the middle class is identified with classical liberalism, which is true. Right, especially during the 19th century, right, when the French Revolution, it is the bourgeoisie middle class which leads the revolution. But prior to that, the people who first articulate these rights are actually aristocrats. It's the Ciceros, it's the Catos, it's the landowners. They're the people who kind of first articulate these classical liberal notions against both what they see as the mob, but also the big authoritarian dictator. So, okay, I guess we'll kind of leave it on that. I know our conversation started on the Roman Empire, but
we go all over the place, but it's great because
it's good.
I really hope that people, when they watch this, learn. I think Roberto and I have a lot to offer. I think that there's a lot of things to discuss, and everything's connected. I think when you study history, you realize that there's trends and ideas that are essentially timeless, and it's interesting how they evolve and how they manifest themselves in different societies. And we focus on the West, but because it's the best, naturally. But there's definitely a lot to be said. So I think, I mean, in closing, we hope everyone has a good weekend and our Labor Day tomorrow. And remember the Romans.
Right.
Remember, the last emperor was a mere boy. He was a mere boy. And
Romulus Augustus was the last emperor.
And isn't that funny? He bore the name of the founder of Rome.
And yes,
Romulus, and then Augustus, who's in the ground of the empire.
Right.
So that was a fitting end. But he was a wee lad, and
right.
I hope his fate wasn't too cruel. I believe Odo Walker did not kill him.
Murdered. I don't think they killed him.
I think he just died in obscurity. I think they gave him some estate in the country and just disappeared from the historical record. Presumably, he just died in obscurity.
Yeah. I think what's his name, Ottokar, the Ostrogothic Germanic chieftain, has a chance to kill him, but he doesn't.
He killed his father, Orestes.
Yeah.
But he was only a boy, so it wasn't. I don't think he posed that much of a threat.
Right.
he also wasn't really considered. He wasn't considered the legitimate emperor in the East. So it wasn't like he was he had legitimacy either once he had been deposed. Um,
Right.
but um, but any last words, Roberta, before I end this?
Uh, just I don't know. I mean, there's so much that we could still talk about, but no. I mean, I guess we'll go to fantasy football now, and okay.
All right,
Thank you
take
for
care.
thank you for having me on. It was great to have this chat.
It's always a pleasure. I couldn't do a video without you, literally.
Right.
So, all right, take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye.